I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it.
The decision was not announced with ceremony. There was no balcony appearance, no grand speech, no warning delivered to the public. Instead, inside the machinery of the monarchy, Prince William authorized an emergency decree with one devastating purpose. Prince Harry was to be permanently excluded from every future succession-related event. In a single act, years of royal tension became something far more serious. An institutional separation, with consequences no private reconciliation could easily reverse. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William sat alone with the decree before him, his eyes returning again and again to Harry's name. The document was not simply another palace instruction. An emergency royal decree, in this story, meant a formal order directing how the future royal household would handle a matter considered too serious to leave unresolved. Succession events included the ceremonies, private preparations, constitutional briefings, rehearsals, councils, and restricted family gatherings, connected to the moment one monarch gives way to the next. By signing, the future king was not removing his brother from one occasion. He was cutting him out of the entire succession structure surrounding his eventual accession. The pen remained still for several seconds. William read the crucial clause once more, then placed his signature beneath it with an expression that carried no victory. He looked exhausted, almost burdened by the certainty of what he had just done. The order permanently removed Harry from future succession preparations, ceremonial roles, closed family proceedings, and every official event tied to William becoming king. Then came the second blow. Palace planners were instructed to rewrite future accession protocols immediately, treating Harry's absence not as a temporary exception, but as the permanent arrangement. Harry received the message privately and did not react at first. He read the wording once, then again, his face tightening as the meaning settled over him. No automatic invitation remained. No special family exemption had been preserved. The Duke finally looked up and asked one question. Had this come directly from his brother? The answer changed the weight of everything. This was not an advisor protecting William from an awkward situation. This was William himself drawing the line. The silence between the brothers suddenly felt larger than any palace room. Harry had lost more than a ceremonial position. He had been removed from a future he once assumed would still contain some place for him. William, meanwhile, had chosen certainty over sentiment, believing the crown could no longer enter its next chapter, carrying unresolved ambiguity beside it. The signature ended Harry's place in the future ceremony. But to understand why William was willing to make that choice, the story has to move away from the document and toward the brothers whose relationship had finally reached its breaking point. Before there were decrees, advisors, palace protocols, or succession rehearsals, there were simply two brothers walking behind the same coffin, surviving the same grief, and growing into radically different lives. That history makes William's decision far more painful than a bureaucratic exclusion. Harry is not a distant cousin being moved from a guest list. He is the younger brother who once stood beside the future king, and now finds himself formally removed from the most important chapter of that future. William understood exactly why the decree carried such emotional force. As heir to the throne, he stood next in line to become monarch, which meant more and more responsibility for shaping the household, ceremonies, and private arrangements that would surround his eventual reign. Succession planning was not simply about who would wear the crown. It covered the controlled transition from one monarch to the next, including who would stand beside the new sovereign, who would enter restricted meetings, and who would represent continuity when the country looked toward the palace for stability. For years, Harry had been expected to remain close to that structure. Now, that assumption was gone. Memory made the decision harder. William paused before another planning meeting and looked at an old photograph of himself beside his brother during an earlier royal engagement. For a few seconds, the years between them seemed to disappear. Then he turned the photograph face down and walked away from it. The gesture carried the truth he had been resisting. Childhood loyalty could not decide the structure of a future reign. Harry felt the same history from the opposite side. Speaking privately with Meghan after reading the decree, he moved between anger and humiliation, insisting that the decision felt like more than exclusion from a ceremony. An accession was the formal beginning of a new monarch's reign, but to him it was also a family moment. Being removed from it felt as though the monarchy was rewriting his place inside his own bloodline. Meghan listened as he returned again and again to the same point. He had expected distance, but not permanent erasure, from the most private moments surrounding his brother's future. William's concern, however, had already moved beyond resentment. He believed succession demanded absolute clarity. Anyone standing within those ceremonies had to represent the crown without confusion over loyalty, role, or responsibility. Harry's position outside the working monarchy had created a divide that was no longer merely geographical. He remained William's brother, but institutionally, he now stood somewhere else. Then another detail landed. Harry learned that the decree did not only remove him from the eventual public accession ceremony, it also barred him from private rehearsals, restricted family gatherings, and closed preparations never intended for public view. That discovery cut deeper, because those were precisely the moments he had assumed family ties would still protect. The relationship had been damaged for years, but damage alone had never produced a decree. Something happened behind closed doors that turned hesitation into action. Every royal rupture has a moment people later identify as the instant everything changed. In this story, it came during a confidential succession rehearsal at Windsor, weeks before William signed the decree. Harry had been invited to a private family discussion intended to test whether future ceremonial participation could still be possible. What happened inside that room did not end with shouting. It ended with something colder. William deciding that trust itself had become impossible. Harry entered knowing the meeting mattered. The Windsor session had been arranged to settle family positioning, ceremonial precedents, restricted access, and contingency plans tied to a future transition of the crown. Ceremonial precedents simply meant the formal order in which members of the royal family would stand, move, or take part during major state occasions. For Harry, the meeting represented one final chance to keep a limited place inside those future moments, even while remaining outside the working monarchy. For William, it was a test of whether that limited role could exist without creating another conflict. The tension sharpened when confidentiality appeared on the table. Harry was asked to accept a condition requiring complete silence around succession preparations, including private rehearsals and restricted family discussions. He rejected it immediately. Looking directly at William, he said he would not accept rules that treated him like an outsider while still expecting him to appear whenever the palace needed a familiar face. The words landed harder than anyone expected because they exposed the central problem neither brother had managed to solve. William did not raise his voice. He answered quietly, telling Harry that succession could not be built around personal exceptions, private resentments, or changing boundaries. The future king insisted that anyone included in those preparations had to accept the same restrictions without negotiation. Harry stared back, anger tightening into something more wounded, then pushed his chair away from the table. Before the discussion had formally ended, he walked out. The closed door changed everything. William remained seated after the room emptied, then asked the remaining aides to leave him alone with the draft protocol. A protocol was simply the written set of rules guiding how a royal ceremony or transition would be organized. He reread the section containing Harry's proposed limited role and sat with it for several long moments. The argument had stopped being about one condition. In his mind, it had become a question of whether trust could survive inside the structure at all. Then the line appeared. Beside Harry's proposed role, William wrote a short amendment: remove participation entirely. Clarity before sentiment. That single note marked the point where private frustration began turning into permanent policy. But William still did not sign the decree immediately. Windsor created the fracture, yet one final confrontation remained. And this time, there would be no advisors in the room, no written conditions to hide behind, and nowhere left for either brother to retreat. The final confrontation did not begin with raised voices. It began with William closing the door. No private secretary remained inside. No aide stood between them. Harry knew immediately that this was no ordinary family conversation, and William knew there would be no second attempt if it failed. Years of resentment, loyalty, accusation, grief, and unresolved brotherhood were compressed into a single question. Could Harry still stand inside the future crown without accepting the boundaries William believed the crown demanded? William chose his words carefully because this was no longer about one argument at Windsor. His future accession, the moment he would formally become king, could not, in his view, become a stage for unresolved family conflict, competing public narratives, or uncertainty over who stood inside the monarchy and who stood outside it. The prince told Harry that every person involved in that transition had to accept the same rules, the same silence, and the same limits. He could not build the future around exceptions that changed whenever emotions rose. Harry did not accept that distinction. He argued that family belonging could not be reduced to whether someone still worked for the institution. Succession might carry constitutional weight, but to him, it was also personal. It was his brother's defining moment, a family milestone tied to decades of shared history. Then his voice hardened. "If you want me gone, then say it to me. Not through a palace memo." William paused. The silence was sharper than anger. He finally answered that he could not promise Harry a place he no longer trusted him to hold. The words landed with brutal simplicity. Harry's frustration shifted almost immediately into hurt. He asked whether their mother would have wanted one brother formally erased from the other's most important day. For a moment, the future king looked shaken, but he did not retreat from the decision. The truth went deeper. William explained that the Windsor confrontation had not created the problem by itself. Repeated disputes over confidentiality, access, expectations, and public responsibility had convinced him that succession planning could no longer depend on case-by-case negotiation. He wanted one permanent rule. Harry listened, then noticed the papers beside his brother, and understood what they were. The decree had already been drafted. That realization changed the room. Harry understood that this was not a discussion about wording or compromise. William had brought him there for one final reason: to tell him personally before the signature made the separation official. The prince had not come seeking permission. He had come delivering the last warning. Harry left without reconciliation. William remained behind with the unsigned decree, knowing the next move would transform private pain into permanent royal policy. But the decision was not being carried by one brother alone. Behind William stood an entire structure determined to prevent the future monarchy from entering another succession surrounded by uncertainty. Royal power rarely moves through dramatic gestures alone. Behind William's signature lay something colder and more methodical. Names checked, ceremonial places reconsidered, security access reviewed, and advisors asking what would happen if unresolved family conflict entered the most sensitive transition of the monarchy. Yet beneath all that machinery, the decision still rested on one man. William had to decide whether protecting the future crown justified permanently excluding his own brother from its defining moment. William understood that succession planning reached far beyond a single ceremony. Household officials handled the practical running of the royal family. Constitutional advisors focused on the legal transfer of authority. Ceremonial coordinators organized formal events, and security teams controlled who could enter restricted spaces. Senior family members also had defined roles designed to show stability when one reign ended and another began. His emergency authority in this story concerned participation in his own future household and accession arrangements. It did not change Harry's biological place in the legal line of succession. It changed whether he would have any official place beside William when that future arrived. Charles read the proposed decree slowly, after his son placed it between them during a private meeting. The king reached the final clause, removed his glasses, and said nothing. William waited. The silence stretched until the emotional meaning became impossible to ignore. This was not simply a future monarch reviewing protocol with the reigning one. It was a father looking at a document that formalized the division between his two sons. Charles finally admitted that their separation felt like a personal failure. He had watched William and Harry move from shared grief into open distance, and now that distance was being written into the structure of the next reign. Still, the monarch would not force the future king into arrangements he believed could collapse under pressure. He told William that ceremonial unity meant little if the trust behind it no longer existed. One final alternative remained. William could suspend Harry temporarily and leave a path for eventual return. The prince rejected it. A reversible decision, he argued, would only carry the same uncertainty into another crisis. If succession planning was meant to protect continuity, then the rules had to be clear before the crown changed hands, not negotiated in the middle of it. Then the machinery began moving. Palace planners quietly revised rehearsal lists and family procession drafts before the public knew anything had changed. Harry's designated places disappeared. Access arrangements shifted. Internal schedules were rewritten as though his absence had already become normal. That was when the decree stopped being only a document. The most painful part was not William's signature itself. It was watching the monarchy begin functioning as though Harry would never be there. A royal exclusion becomes real when the empty space appears on the page. Harry's name is removed from succession briefing lists. His ceremonial position disappears. Routes are redrawn, family holding rooms reassigned, confidential access categories amended. What had once been an emotional argument between brothers is now visible in black and white. And when Harry finally sees proof that the palace has begun planning the future without him, anger is no longer the first emotion that rises. Harry received the updated protocol extract and immediately noticed what was missing. A protocol extract was simply a shortened section of the formal planning document showing who would take part, where they would stand, and what access they would have during future royal events. His name no longer appeared beside the family roll once reserved for him. Another arrangement had replaced it. The change mattered because it separated two things that had once seemed impossible to divide. He was still William's brother by blood, but he no longer had an official place inside the future succession structure. The page suddenly felt heavier than the decree itself. Harry read the revised section twice, folded it once, placed it on the table, and walked away without speaking. There was no burst of anger this time. The humiliation came quietly. For years, he had accepted that his public royal role had changed, but he had still believed certain private family moments would remain beyond politics, protocol, and institutional punishment. Meghan found him later, and understood almost immediately that grief had replaced outrage. He told her that he had expected distance from ceremonies, perhaps even restrictions around official duties, but not complete removal from the private gatherings surrounding his brother's accession. She listened as he struggled with the idea that some doors he assumed would always remain open had now been closed in advance. What hurt most was not losing a position in a procession. It was learning that family history no longer guaranteed presence. Then, Another detail confirmed the finality. Harry discovered that no automatic invitation had been preserved for restricted succession gatherings either. Those were the closed family meetings and preparations normally shielded from public attention. The decree had meant exactly what it said. No ceremonial role, no rehearsal place, no private access by default. William asked aides whether his brother had acknowledged the notice. When told there had been no response, the future king's expression briefly changed. Certainty had given him control over the succession plan, but it had not removed the cost. He had wanted clarity. Now he was seeing what clarity looked like when written across his brother's absence. The silence between them seemed complete. The crown had settled Harry's official future, but the brothers still had one final question to answer in private. Was anything left between William and Harry when the monarchy was removed from the room? For the first time since the decree, there are no advisors, no protocols, and no papers on the table. William and Harry meet privately, as brothers rather than royal figures. Neither man expects reconciliation. Neither believes the decree will disappear. Yet the absence of institutional language changes the conversation completely. What follows does not repair the past, but it finally separates two truths they had allowed to become tangled: Harry's place in William's life and Harry's place in William's future reign. Harry spoke first, because there was little left to protect. The decree had already taken effect, which meant this meeting was not another negotiation, and neither brother could pretend otherwise. William made that clear almost immediately. Succession participation, the formal role someone holds in ceremonies and preparations connected to a future change of monarch, had been settled permanently. Family contact was different. That, he said, was still a personal choice between them, not something a palace document could decide. The distinction did not comfort Harry as much as William expected. He told his brother that the decree had felt less like losing a place in a ceremony and more like discovering that the future king had imagined an entire reign in which he simply did not exist. His voice stayed controlled, but the hurt underneath it was unmistakable. He could accept that their lives had separated. What he struggled to accept was seeing that separation turned into a permanent rule. William did not defend himself with anger. He admitted that he had hesitated before signing because he knew exactly how Harry would read it. The prince understood it would feel like rejection, but he said constitutional planning could not depend on the hope that their relationship might suddenly become stable. The crown required decisions to be made before a crisis arrived, not during one. He had chosen certainty because he no longer trusted emotion to repair what years of conflict had damaged. Harry then surprised him. He said he would not publicly fight for reinstatement. He would not demand another role, challenge the decree through interviews, or beg to stand inside a ceremony that had already been closed to him. If his place had to be argued for, he no longer wanted it. William looked at him differently after that. He said removing Harry from succession events had never meant erasing him as a brother. The words did not heal the wound, and Harry did not pretend they did. But for the first time, he understood the boundary William had been trying to draw. One relationship belonged to the crown, the other belonged to them. The brothers left without embracing and without reversing course. Yet the tone had changed, and outside palace walls, the story was about to become larger than either of them. By morning, the private decree had become a national spectacle. The language was brutal in its simplicity. Harry would have no role in William's future succession events. Broadcasters debated whether the move represented discipline or tragedy. Commentators argued over duty, brotherhood, and the price of royal stability. But one public moment cut through all the analysis, a single image outside Buckingham Palace that seemed to capture exactly what the country believed had been lost. William watched the coverage without speaking. The announcement had transformed years of family tension into something far more permanent than another palace dispute. This was now a structural separation. meaning the distance between the brothers had been built directly into future royal planning, rather than left as a temporary personal conflict. Some commentators praised the prince for creating clarity around the crown. Others argued that certainty had come at an emotional cost, too painful to ignore. The debate became harder for William when the conversation moved away from protocol. Broadcasters began showing old photographs of the brothers together, reminding viewers that the men now divided by the future monarchy had once stood beside each other through grief, duty, and public pressure. The future king remained composed, but his discomfort showed when the story shifted from institutional responsibility to childhood loyalty. The decree may have settled policy, but it could not control memory. Harry faced the same images from the other side. He watched earlier moments with William replay across television screens, while presenters discussed how far the relationship had fallen. Then one major broadcaster delivered the line that seemed to define the entire story. One brother inherits the crown. The other has now been removed from the ceremony surrounding it. Harry reached for the remote and turned the broadcast off before the segment ended. Outside Buckingham Palace, the division became something people could physically gather around. A small crowd formed near the gates, as newspaper stands carried a stark front page showing William walking ahead alone beneath the headline, "The Future Without Harry." The image spread quickly because it reduced years of tension to one painful idea. The next royal chapter had been planned with one brother moving forward and the other absent from it. The public response remained divided. Some saw strength in William's refusal to leave succession arrangements uncertain. Others saw a family wound being made permanent in the name of stability. Yet neither applause nor criticism could reverse what had already happened. The headlines made the rupture visible to the world, but the final judgment would not be written by newspapers. It would be written in the lives William and Harry chose after the door had closed. In the end, the emergency decree did exactly what William intended. It removed uncertainty. Harry would not stand inside the succession machinery of his brother's future reign. There would be no last-minute negotiation, no ceremonial compromise, no unresolved question waiting to explode at the moment the crown changed hands. But clarity came at a human cost. The monarchy gained a cleaner future, while two brothers were forced to accept that love, history, and duty do not always lead people toward the same door. William placed the signed decree into the final succession file and closed it without ceremony. The succession file was simply the formal collection of plans, roles, instructions, and arrangements prepared for the transition to a new reign. Harry's exclusion was now permanent across rehearsals, restricted preparations, official ceremonial roles, and private succession gatherings connected to William's eventual accession. Yet the document stopped at the edge of family life. It defined Harry's institutional place in the future monarchy, not whether the brothers could ever speak, meet, or remember each other outside it. Harry had already decided he would not ask for restoration. Speaking privately with Meghan, he told her that if his place depended on repeatedly seeking permission from his brother, then he would rather build meaning somewhere beyond the ceremony. She understood that the choice carried pain, but also a strange kind of release. He had lost the future role he once assumed would always be there, yet he was no longer waiting for the palace to decide whether he belonged. Charles accepted the outcome with sadness rather than resistance. The king understood that his sons would not return to the arrangement once imagined for them, and he no longer believed forcing an appearance of unity would heal anything. A staged closeness would only preserve an illusion. He wanted both men to live with the truth, rather than perform a version of family peace that no longer existed. William reached the same conclusion from the other side. The decree had become less a punishment than a boundary. The future monarchy would operate without Harry inside its succession structure, while his younger brother's life would no longer be measured by whether the crown offered him a ceremonial place. There was no final reversal, no hidden clause, and no last-minute reconciliation, waiting beyond the decree. William moved forward toward the crown, without Harry beside him, while Harry stepped permanently outside the ceremonies that once defined his birthright. The monarchy survived, the succession became clear, and the brothers finally accepted that their futures, once inseparable, now led in different directions. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.